Imagine waking up one morning in the most beautiful place on Earth. Crystal clear water, so blue it almost looks painted.
White sand beaches that stretch for miles under a perfect Pacific sky. Coconut palms swaying in a warm tropical breeze. Fish so plentiful you could practically reach into the water and pull your dinner out with your hands. This is not a dream.
This was real life, and it was home to a small community of people who had lived there for generations, completely untouched by the chaos of the modern world. Now imagine that one day, a group of strangers in military uniforms shows up at your shore, tells you that your home is needed, not for you, not for your children, not for your future, but for the good of all mankind. And they ask you, politely but firmly, to leave. You were promised you can come back soon. But that promise, it was the biggest lie of the entire 20th century. Stay with us and subscribe, because what happened next on this tiny speck of coral and sand in the middle of the Pacific Ocean is one of the most shocking, most tragic, and most deliberately hidden stories of the Cold War era. Bikini Atoll sits quietly in the heart of the Pacific Ocean, part of a vast collection of islands and coral reefs known today as the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Located roughly halfway between Hawaii and Papua New Guinea, this remote cluster of 23 small coral islands forms a rough ring around a central lagoon of breathtaking turquoise water. Before the world ever took notice of it, Bikini Atoll, known to its indigenous people as Bikini, was simply home. The Marshallese people who lived there were deeply connected to the land and sea, living by a traditional way of life built on fishing, farming, and a deeply communal culture that had been passed down over many centuries. Their world was self-sufficient, peaceful, and in many ways, as close to paradise as a place could realistically get. The Marshall Islands had not always been under American control. For decades, different colonial powers had passed the islands between them like property in a board game. Germany once administered them, then Japan took control following World War I under a League of Nations mandate. During the fierce Pacific theater of World War II, American forces wrested the islands away from Japanese control through some of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. When the dust finally settled and the last Japanese forces surrendered in 1945, the United States emerged as the dominant authority over a vast stretch of the northern Pacific, including the Marshall Islands. It was an acquisition that would soon carry enormous consequences for the people who called those islands home. In 1946, the United Nations formalized American authority over the Marshall Islands through a legal arrangement called the Trust Territory of the Pacific. On the surface, this arrangement sounded reasonable. The United States would serve as the administering power, responsible for the welfare, development, and security of the Marshallese people. But buried within this agreement was something far more sinister. A quiet understanding that gave America broad latitude to conduct its military activities on what was technically foreign soil. This legal framework, as one historical analysis later described it, allowed the United States to pursue its nuclear testing program both secretly and on territory it did not actually own. The Marshallese people, who had no representative voice in these negotiations, never knew what was being arranged around them. The decision to use the Marshall Islands as a nuclear testing ground did not happen in a vacuum. It came directly from the aftermath of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. Those two devastating explosions had ended World War II in spectacular and horrifying fashion, and suddenly the entire world understood that nuclear weapons represented an entirely new category of destructive power. American military leaders wanted to understand exactly what these weapons could do, not just to cities and people, but to naval warships, military infrastructure, and the ocean environment itself. President Harry Truman specifically directed the military to examine the effect of atomic bombs on American ships. What began as a research mission quickly took on a far broader and more dangerous shape as Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union began to rise rapidly on the global stage. Military planners needed a testing site that was remote enough to maintain secrecy, far enough from populated areas to minimize immediate civilian risk, and yet accessible enough for aircraft and naval vessels to operate around it effectively. They surveyed dozens of potential locations before settling on the Marshall Islands, in specifically Bikini Atoll. The atoll checked every box. It was isolated, it sat far from major shipping lanes, its wide, deep lagoon could accommodate an entire fleet of naval vessels, and it had a small, manageable population that, with the right kind of persuasion, could be moved. That last detail was not an afterthought. It was, from the very beginning, a central part of the plan. In early 1946, a United States Navy Commodore named Ben Wyatt arrived on the shores of Bikini Atoll. He had come with a mission that required a great deal of careful diplomacy. He needed to convince the 167 people who lived on the atoll, men, women, and children, to abandon their home. Wyatt met with the island's leader, King Judah, and delivered a carefully scripted appeal. He told the Bikinians that their sacrifice would serve the good of mankind. He framed the evacuation as part of a great and noble project, one that could help develop weapons powerful enough to prevent future wars from ever happening again. It was, in many ways, an appeal to their generosity and their faith. Wyatt reportedly even invoked religious language, comparing the Bikinians to the people of the Bible making sacrifices for a greater divine purpose. King Judah, moved by the appeal and trusting in the word of the American military, gave his consent. He reportedly said to his people, in words that were later recorded and widely quoted, "We will go, believing that everything is in the hands of God." It was a statement of profound faith and trust, and it was trust that would be catastrophically betrayed. The Bikinians were told firmly and repeatedly that the evacuation was temporary. They would be resettled nearby while the tests took place, and when everything was finished, they would be brought home. They packed only what they could carry. They left behind their graves, their gardens, their canoes, and everything they could not fit into their arms. They had no reason to believe they would never truly return. The Bikinian people were relocated to Rongerik Atoll, an uninhabited island located about 125 miles to the east of their home. Almost immediately, things began to go wrong. Rongerik was small, far smaller than Bikini, and its resources were completely inadequate to support the community. The coconut trees were sparse, the fishing was poor, and the local fish supply was, in some areas, actually toxic. Within months, the relocated Bikinians were facing serious food shortages. Accounts from the period describe widespread malnourishment. By 1948, the situation had become so dire that the community was relocated again, this time to Kwajalein Atoll, and then eventually to Kili Island, a tiny 200-acre strip of land that was among the smallest and most resource-poor islands in the entire Marshall Islands chain. These were not temporary accommodations. They were the beginning of a permanent exile. While the Bikinians struggled to survive on islands that were never meant to support them,
The United States military was busy transforming their home into something entirely different. Bikini Atoll became the stage for a massive military operation that would come to be known as Operation Crossroads. The purpose of this operation was to test nuclear weapons against a fleet of target ships anchored in the lagoon, to determine what atomic blasts would do to modern naval vessels at various distances. It was billed publicly as a scientific investigation. Dozens of journalists, foreign dignitaries, and military observers from around the world were invited to watch. 2 tests were conducted, one aerial detonation on July 1st, 1946, and one underwater detonation on July 25th, 1946. The lagoon that had once been home to a thriving community was now a theater of nuclear spectacle. The tests of Operation Crossroads were the first nuclear detonations conducted by the United States since the bombs dropped on Japan, and they revealed something that military planners had not fully anticipated. Radiation was far more persistent, far more insidious, and far more difficult to control than anyone had initially calculated. The underwater detonation in particular coated the target ships with so much radioactive contamination that cleanup crews became seriously ill just from attempting to decontaminate the vessels. The operation was eventually called off due to the health risks it posed to the personnel involved. And yet, despite these early and alarming warning signs about the dangers of nuclear fallout, the United States chose not to stop its testing program. Instead, it expanded it dramatically. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated a total of 67 nuclear weapons across the Marshall Islands, 23 of them directly at Bikini Atoll. The combined explosive yield of these detonations was staggering. When measured in total force, the sum of all these explosions was roughly equivalent to 7,000 times the power of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. 7,000 times. Let that sink in. This was not a handful of carefully controlled experiments. This was a sustained, years-long program of nuclear detonation on a scale that had never been seen in human history before. And all of it was happening on a group of beautiful coral islands in the middle of the Pacific, far from the eyes of the world and hidden behind layers of government secrecy and deliberate misdirection. Of all the tests conducted in the Marshall Islands, one stands apart from the rest, not just in scale, but in the sheer magnitude of its consequences. On the morning of March 1st, 1954, American scientists and military personnel prepared to detonate a thermonuclear device codenamed Shrimp as part of a test series called Castle Bravo. The weapon was expected to produce an explosive yield of around 6 megatons, already almost unimaginably powerful. What actually happened shattered every expectation. The device detonated with a force of 15 megatons, nearly 3 times its predicted yield. The explosion was 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It vaporized 3 entire islands in the atoll. It blasted a crater into the ocean floor that was a mile wide and 200 feet deep. And it launched a massive column of radioactive material high into the atmosphere. The fallout from Castle Bravo did not stay at the test site. Driven by winds and ocean currents that military planners had either miscalculated or chosen to ignore, a thick cloud of radioactive ash drifted across a vast expanse of the Pacific. The fallout, which witnesses described as resembling fine white snow, began settling on inhabited atolls located more than 100 miles away from the blast site. Rongelap Atoll, home to a community of Marshallese people, was coated in up to 2 centimeters of irradiated debris. Children who had never been told what radiation was ran outside to play in what looked like a beautiful, unexpected snowfall. Adults continued their daily outdoor work,
completely unaware that the white powder coating their skin, their food, and their water supply was lethally contaminated. 3 days passed before any evacuation order arrived. The health consequences on the population of Rongelap were immediate and devastating. Within hours and days of the fallout, residents began experiencing a collection of symptoms that no one in their community had ever seen before. Skin began to burn and blister. Hair began to fall out in clumps. Eyes became inflamed and painful. People vomited repeatedly and suffered severe gastrointestinal illness. These were the classic signs of acute radiation sickness, the body's response to being flooded with dangerous levels of ionizing radiation. When the evacuation finally came, the people of Rongelap were taken to Kwajalein for medical evaluation, but the story did not end with their treatment. Within days of the Castle Bravo detonation, the United States government quietly set up a secret program to study the medical effects of radiation on the Marshall Islanders without ever telling them that they were being used as research subjects. Castle Bravo's fallout did not stop at the edges of the Marshall Islands. Radioactive particles were later detected across enormous distances in Japan, in India, in Australia, in parts of Europe, and even in the continental United States. A Japanese fishing vessel called the Lucky Dragon, operating more than 80 miles from the test site, was showered with radioactive ash. Its entire crew of 23 men fell ill with radiation sickness, and one of them later died from the exposure. The incident caused an international outcry and brought widespread global attention to the dangers of atmospheric nuclear testing for the first time. Scientists around the world began to warn publicly that the radioactive contamination from nuclear tests was not staying in one place. It was entering the global food chain, the atmosphere, and the bodies of human beings who had never gone anywhere near a nuclear weapon. The long-term health consequences that unfolded across the Marshall Islands in the years and decades following the testing program represent one of the most profound public health disasters in modern history, and one of the least discussed. Residents of the northern atolls, those closest to the test sites, suffered the most severe exposures. Studies conducted by the National Cancer Institute later concluded that thyroid doses received by Rongelap community members were among the highest ever recorded in any human population exposed to nuclear fallout outside of a direct bomb blast. Children who were young at the time of Castle Bravo received thyroid radiation doses estimated to be 3 times higher than those received by adults. The thyroid gland, which concentrates iodine from the environment, became a particular target of the radioactive iodine-131 released by the tests. In the years that followed, Marshall Islanders began suffering from diseases their communities had never known before. Rates of thyroid cancer climbed to extraordinary levels. Women across the affected atolls experienced alarming rates of miscarriages, stillbirths, and severe reproductive abnormalities. The testimony of one Marshall Islander, Lijan Eknalong, delivered before an international audience, remains among the most haunting accounts of what the nuclear legacy meant at a human level. She described babies born without bones in their bodies, with translucent skin through which one could see their organs. She described infants born without arms or legs, without recognizable features, living only for a day or two before dying. The Marshallese people, who had no word in their own language for such things, called these children jellyfish babies. The cancers, the deformities, the generational grief, all of it was the direct inheritance of a dozen years of nuclear testing on their home. While the Bikinian people suffered in exile, American officials made a series of promises to them that were systematically broken. President Lyndon B. Johnson promised in 1968 that the Bikini people would be able to return to their home, citing scientific assessments that claimed radiation levels had dropped to safe thresholds. A small number of families, trusting this assurance, moved back to their island in the early 1970s. For a brief time, it seemed as though the nightmare might finally be ending. But the optimism did not last. Scientists who returned to examine the island more carefully discovered that the wells were too contaminated for drinking, that staple foods like breadfruit and pandanus had concentrated radioactive isotopes and were dangerous to consume, and that the coconut crabs, a key food source, were carrying unacceptably high levels of radioactivity in their flesh. Women who had returned began experiencing miscarriages at elevated rates. An 11-year-old boy who had been born on the island after the return died of cancer directly linked to his radiation exposure there. The second evacuation came in 1978. The Bikinians had been betrayed a second time. The psychological damage inflicted on the Marshallese people has been as profound as the physical harm. Generations of communities were uprooted from ancestral lands that held centuries of cultural meaning, land where their ancestors were buried, where their traditions were born, where their identity was rooted. The forced migration began in 1946 and, in many ways, never truly ended. A 2012 report by the United Nations concluded that displacement caused by the nuclear testing program had created what it called nomads, people who were disconnected from their lands, their cultural practices, and their indigenous ways of life. Activists, survivors, and advocates have spent decades petitioning international bodies for recognition and compensation. The Nuclear Claims Tribunal, established in 1988, eventually awarded the people of Bikini more than $563 million in compensation. The United States Congress, however, never fully funded those awards. The gap between what was promised and what was delivered continues to define the relationship between the Marshallese people and the American government to this day.
Today, Bikini Atoll remains largely uninhabitable for human beings. Soil tests continue to detect radioactive isotopes including cesium-137, strontium-90, plutonium, and americium, long-lived radionuclides that will remain in the environment for centuries to come. A 2016 study conducted by Columbia University found that radiation levels in certain parts of the Marshall Islands remain nearly double the threshold considered safe for permanent human habitation. Some independent researchers have found that specific areas register radiation levels higher than those found in the most contaminated zones near Chernobyl and Fukushima. The atoll does have occasional visitors, a small group of caretakers, scientific research teams, and scuba divers who come to explore the ghost fleet of sunken battleships at the bottom of the lagoon, a hauntingly beautiful and deeply eerie reminder of Operation Crossroads. But no community calls it home. The people who once lived there, whose grandchildren and great-grandchildren are now scattered across Keeley Island, Majuro, and American cities like Springdale, Arkansas, still bury their dead above ground in the places where they now live, so that one day, if they ever return, they can take their loved ones back to their true homeland. That day has not come. And for many, it may never come at all. Bikini Atoll was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2010, not because of its beauty, though that beauty still exists beneath the surface in ways that continue to astonish visiting scientists and divers. It was designated because of what it represents:
tangible, enduring evidence of the dawn of the nuclear age and the human cost of the Cold War arms race. The corals have grown back, the fish have returned. The underwater world around Bikini is, in certain strange ways, thriving, precisely because no human being can safely live there anymore. The island has become, as one researcher described it, an accidental marine sanctuary, protected not by conservation law, but by contamination. There is something deeply ironic about that. A paradise preserved by the very thing that destroyed its people. The story of Bikini Atoll is not simply a historical footnote. It is a warning that echoes across every decade that has followed. It is the story of what happens when governments treat human beings as acceptable losses in the pursuit of military power. It is the story of a people who were told their sacrifice was temporary, only to discover it was permanent. It is the story of children playing in radioactive snow because no one told them what was falling from the sky. And it is a story that the world has been dangerously slow to fully reckon with. The people of the Marshall Islands are still living with the consequences today, in their bodies, in their communities, and in the climate crisis that now threatens to swallow their low-lying islands beneath a rising sea, adding yet another layer of catastrophe to a history already heavy with tragedy. If you took anything from this story today, let it be this. The most dangerous lies are not the ones that sound obviously false. They are the ones that come wrapped in the language of sacrifice, of progress, of the greater good. They are the ones spoken by authority figures to people who had every reason to trust them. The Bikinians trusted, and for that trust, they lost everything. Their island, their health, their children's futures. That story deserves to be remembered. And now you know it.